I'd like to call the meeting to order. And first off, we have public comment. We have one comment card by Mr. Ralph Hoffman.
Good evening. Ralph Hoffman from BART proximate downtown Walnut Creek. The articles in front of you are from my putting them there, titled Gauging Costs of Climate Change, was in today's business section of the Contra Costa Times. The subject was also the featured subject last night on the nightly business report. And quite simply, this is the first attempt, and notice the three chairs are fiscal conservatives of this committee, but this is the first attempt that I have seen to measure the cost in the United States of climate change. And if you look at this and sort of total it up, first of all, you come to the conclusion that it may total something like $1 trillion. We only have 200 million people plus total in the U.S. Plus the other thing, which may explain why California is recovering from the Great Recession sooner than other parts of the country, is quite simply, you notice they discuss different parts of the country and how they've been affected by climate change, and the West Coast is not listed there. We are, of course, this is a world problem, probably why I'm hoarse, because countries like China and India are also experiencing very serious effects of climate change and particulates in the air from coal burning, of power plants, for example. Of course, you get a little hoarse like me. The simple fact is we need here and everywhere in this country need to concentrate more on transit villages, like this was the first in the county here, and we're at the cusp of the transit village finally in downtown Walnut Creek. I moved there 7 years ago and dumped the pump, and have been using public transit ever since. And I would urge all of you to consider doing that, quite simply. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, you might say. But it's the only way by 2050 we can, as I see it, recover from, at least partially, from climate change. There certainly are things like the melting of the ice cap in Antarctica. That won't freeze again because it's elevated, and that's what's causing the sea levels to rise. Fortunately, here in California, it's not as severe as on the East Coast or the Southeast. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have some extra copies, by the way.
You leave them on the back table and people can get them. All right, move on to the approval of a summary of actions from our May meeting. Any corrections? Entertain a motion.
Move to adopt.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And one abstention by Mr. Bernhardt. Okay, just review the attendance log for your entry. Any corrections to that? If not, we'll see the meeting calendar We will meet in July at our usual time frame, but then in keeping with authority practice, there will be no meeting in August. And finally, if you want to take a quick look at your entry in the roster, my entry still needs to reflect the fact that I've been reappointed. Any other corrections? Okay, we'll move right into our major discussion items. The first one is review of City of Concord's calendar years 2012 and 2013 Growth Management Program Compliance Checklist. And if you could introduce yourself, sir.
Good evening. My name is Ray Kuzbari. I'm the Transportation Manager for the City of Concord. Thank you for the opportunity to review the checklist for the City of Concord for the reporting period of calendar years 2012 and 2013. I just have a brief statement to say that we believe that the City of Concord is in compliance with the Growth Management Program for the reporting period. And I will be happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you. You want to open with the...
Well, we really don't have the growth management subcommittee anymore. But anyways, I had submitted some questions to Martin, noticing that during this reporting period that the Concord Reuse Project Area Plan was approved, and that was something that's been coming for years. And I was really hoping that there could be, I know it's short notice, I was hoping that there could be a presentation on what option you did decide on, and exactly how the land use designations were going to be, because I think there were like 3 or 4 different options on that. And so I don't know if you can comment on that, or if you can refer us to some site that we can get some more information on that. But I think it's of major interest to everybody on this committee.
Yeah, I can comment a little bit, but Michael Wright is the Executive Director for the Concord Reuse project, and I will discuss with him maybe the possibility of him giving this committee a presentation on the status of the project. I believe he came in 2 years ago, if I remember correctly.
Sure.
Martin would know. So if it's the wishes of the committee for Michael to come back and give a presentation, I can certainly explore that with him.
Yeah, I would really like that, because that's probably the most major development project in the county forthcoming, and I think it would really be good if we could get a good understanding of that.
But I can give you just a quick overview of the project. So we're looking at a site that's about 5,000 acres, and most of it is going to be set aside for habitat conservation and restoration, open space, passive recreational lands, and other areas for parks. And so we're looking at nearly 69% of the project site will be dedicated to open space and uses that are related to that. And the rest, about 31%, that's the extent of the area that is being proposed for development. So the major portion of the project site are not going to be developed. But the area that will be developed, we're looking at about 6 million square feet of commercial space and about 12,200 housing units. I have other information. So basically, we're looking at, like I said, 69% of the land that will be set aside for greenways, city parks, and recreational lands and open space. And the 1,500 remaining acres, those will be phased out for the next 35 years. It's an extensive project, and the city is now looking at implementing phase one. And there's a process in place to select a master developer to implement phase one. There was a request for qualifications sent out last January, and many developers submitted statements of qualifications, and the council very recently selected 4 of those developers for further evaluation of their qualifications for potentially serving as the master developer. And the names of those developers are as follows. The first one is Catalyst Development Corporation. The second one is 5 Point Communities / Lennar. The third one is J.F. Shea Company. And the fourth one is SunCal Corporation. So I think the rest of the process is to have these 4 developers submit proposals. And then later in the year, the city will decide on the top 2. And then they will start negotiating and selecting the master developer early 2015.
How many housing units or units are involved in phase one?
I've got those numbers as well. So phase one, we're looking at about, again, those approximate numbers, 2,773 residential units. And about 589,000 square feet of commercial space.
Okay, so that's about a quarter of the ultimate.
Almost,
Yeah.
a little bit less than that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, on the residential side, it's close to 25%, but on the commercial side, it's on the low side.
Yeah.
So the phase one is mostly residential. And in 2012, the City Council passed a resolution with the intent to have 25% of the phase one housing to meet affordability criteria.
And
That's
to,
going to be my next question.
go ahead. You want?
No, that's
Yeah, and to clarify, I have been following this for some years. As I understand it, the Navy still owns the property, and any transactions will be between the Navy and whoever develops the land. And Concord's main benefit is the fact that you now have new, vibrant communities.
Well, there are many ways this can go as far as the transfer of land, but if I'm not mistaken, I think we're looking at having the Navy give the city control over the land sometime maybe late 2015 or something. And then the land would be transferred to the master developer from that point, from the city.
Yeah.
Again, everything is pending negotiations with the master developer.
Okay.
Ray, excuse me, aren't they in the process of trying to get the parkland transferred to East Bay Regional Parks and like the golf course land also transferred over to the city right now? That isn't that process trying to be accomplished?
That is what is being, what we're trying to accomplish.
Yep.
That's why I said, I mean, I think there has been some talk about how the transfer should take place. Should it go straight to the developers, but I think the prevailing approach right now is to transfer the land to the city first. Although, as far as the open space is concerned, that transfer is probably going to go to East Bay Regional Parks.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, I have a question. Among the plans that we saw a couple of years ago were plans for community college or college extension. Is that part of the adopted plan?
I don't have specific information on that, but the Cal State East Bay was contemplating coming, and last I heard that they pulled the plug. So I'm not sure what's going to happen.
I believe that because the position there at the end of BART, where BART has a station nearby, that encouraged East Bay Cal State to be very happy to have a part of its campus up down there, because it's very hard for some people to make it up the hill.
I'm just not sure that Cal State still wants to come to
Well, I hope they do.
to the site because I don't know if they have other plans or something, but
Ray, I'm like you. I've read that Cal State's pulled out of it.
yeah.
That they can't afford it anymore because of the state budget crisis.
Well,
Okay.
that's supposed to turn around.
And I also have questions about looking at the housing charts, and I want to make it clear that I very much appreciate the difficulty of construction, and also the fact that with the absence of redevelopment agencies, cities and other jurisdictions have pretty much lost their ability to create any housing. And I think it's going to be a real struggle. So I really appreciate who have put together the document in such a short notice as to how the city sees itself in fulfilling its obligation.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I was going to ask about if you don't have jurisdiction over it, you wouldn't be able to give permits for building, and therefore using some of that new area for future affordable housing is still way in the future. I can see that.
Yes.
Any further questions? Entertain a motion.
I move that we accept the Concord's compliance checklist.
Second.
Seconded by Larry. Actually, it's a recommend approval, but all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Thank you.
Steve, before we move on, I don't know if this is appropriate or maybe later in the meeting, but I'd kind of like to know whether the feeling of the committee is to have a presentation on the Concord reuse project. Do you think that's something that we should be looking into?
Yeah, I was going to raise it when we got to the section of future agenda items.
Okay, I was just talking because I'm sure that Ray's probably going to go home after this.
You know,
So I just
Stephen, my feeling is that we should wait until the city gets more correlated into the master developer and who they're going to choose and get some information from that, because then there's a much more positive direction on what's happening versus sort of, well, let's say what happens or doesn't happen. Right now, until that's done, you're just going to get reiterated what we've had before.
Okay.
Would it be more appropriate to have someone buy in 6 months? Be pretty well down the road with your master developer by then?
I believe so. I'll discuss it with Michael
All
Wright, and I will see what his thoughts are. If he feels that maybe there's a wealth of information that you could share anyway in the next, few months, maybe he can come by and
Well, yeah,
give
you
a
can be in touch
presentation.
with,
Otherwise, he could wait until the master developer has been selected.
with Martin and or Diane about that, whatever would seem to work the best.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, we pass on to City of Brentwood's calendar year 2012 and 2013 growth management program checklist.
Good evening, I'm Steve Kursavan. I'm the traffic manager for the city of Brentwood. You have before you our checklist, which I'm sure you all read from page to page, from the front to the back, and have memorized, and you probably know it better than I do. But just in case, I am here to answer any questions. City of Brentwood thinks that they've complied admirably. We are kind of right in the middle of the fruits of your labor in that we've got the Sand Creek Interchange currently under construction. We've got Highway 4 under construction. We have the 160 connector ramps under construction. So a lot of construction, but it starts with you guys, and it's worked its way to actual, people on the street building things, and we're seeing a difference as a result. But getting back to the checklist, I'll gladly answer any questions you might have regarding that list.
Well, I do concur that, that Brentwood has certainly demonstrated compliance. I just had a couple of questions. I was reading in the paper just earlier this week about how Brentwood had undergone a general plan update, and it appeared that there was a real emphasis on preserving green space and ag land. Is that a pretty fair assessment?
That's a very fair assessment. We are, in fact, just about done with our general plan. The last dotting of the I and crossing of the T as it goes to the City Council on the 22nd of July for final adoption. The new general plan has, in fact, added more ag land than the original one. And most of that land, I don't know however familiar everybody is with Brentwood, but it's at I know you are, you've got it, you know it better than I do. The southern portion of Brentwood, where we have a lot of our U-Pick farms, which is bounded by what used to be the bypass, but new Highway 4, Marsh Creek, and Walnut is where we've added ag land. So it's actually increased from what we had before.
Has the southern part, I think there was some project that was visualized about 10 years ago. I'm trying to remember what the name of it was, where there was an intent to have like a vineyards and
Trilogy subdivision?
What is it?
Is it Trilogy?
Yes.
No, I think it had to do something with. I don't think it was a Trilogy subdivision, but there was. I almost want to say the Marsh Creek plan or something like that. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but
Trilogy exists right off of Marsh Creek and is fully covered in vineyards with homes basically that sit in between the vineyards with what was supposed to be a working winery and an amphitheater and all that.
Yeah,
that is
exactly.
actually off of Marsh Creek, and it's called the Vineyards or Trilogy subdivision.
yes, and that has happened.
It's happened.
Wow,
And it
okay.
continues to happen. They have already sold homes, and they are now selling more and more homes.
That's great. And looking at the housing goals for Brentwood, you're one of the few jurisdictions that actually have produced any very low or low units. Is there anything you could share with your success?
I don't want to sit here and pat ourselves on the back too much. I mean, I think it's a condition that Brentwood has the opportunity that not a lot of other cities have, because we have land that has been sitting for years that is now started to develop. We were fortunate. We had two specific projects come to Brentwood, which were strictly low income. One of them is called Meta Housing, which is on Brentwood Boulevard, and the other one is Villa Amador at the corner of Sand Creek and Shady Willow. I apologize for putting all these streets and stuff. For most of you guys probably don't have no idea where I'm talking about.
This
But
is how we
anyway,
learn.
but those were strictly low income. We have kept our low income ordinance intact, so the developers are still required. The city still offers loan programs for first-time buyers, and we still have staff dedicated strictly to housing. So although those staff members used to be 3 and now it's 1, we have retained them, and so we continue to go toward that goal.
Okay, great. That's all I have.
No
I
traffic
have a
questions?
question.
Go ahead, Sally.
Okay. I finally was able to break the code and look inside some of your attachments on my computer. And one of the things I found was a letter from the HCD, California. And I only found one. It was dated 2012. And it said, revising will be necessary to comply with state housing element law on recommending where the future sites will be for affordable housing. And I imagine in the last 2 years you've done something to satisfy them.
We have, and the next step we're going to take is as soon as our general plan is complete, which is next month, we will begin another housing element. So it will all be identified in that, and the numbers will still be. In Brentwood, we know where most of them are. What's happened there is there are tracts of land that were literally ready to be developed that when the economy went down, basically sat there. Those developers are now coming back to town, or they're selling them to other developers. And I'll give you an example. In its heyday, Brentwood would issue 1,500 building permits for residential single-family homes a year. The last few years, that number went to 30. This year, it's 450. So they are coming slowly. But we will be looking at the housing element, waiting for the general plan and its results so that we can tailor it to match the two.
I have another question too on providing places for employment. I know people in the East County are really hoping to develop places where people can work and reverse the commute a little. Then when I was reading about Brentwood Boulevard improvement, is there much there for employment, job development?
I guess it depends on what you want to do for a living.
Well, there
But,
was the
yeah,
special,
there
we had a
is.
special
There is.
plan for,
Yeah, there is a Brentwood Boulevard specific plan, which is literally commercial and residential mix. The next big boost to the job market will be with the completion of the Sand Creek interchange, which, I don't know if you've been out there, but basically between Lone Tree Way and Sand Creek Road on either side of what was the bypass and what is now State Route 4, there is nothing. But the completion of this project, along with the possible extension of E-BART to that area, will open that up. And in fact, there is a project coming called Bridal Gate, which will be built on the west side of where Sand Creek and the Highway 4 meet, that will link that subdivision straight into the road that leads to Home Depot, and that entire strip will then become a commercial office type job area. So, and we do also have an economic development department who deal strictly with these kind of issues. If you've ever been out to what's called the streets of Brentwood, they've been adding stores and restaurants also. So it's getting there. We need the infrastructure to get the people there, and that's coming with the improvements to Highway 4 and the interchange. The next step for us would be the interchange at Balfour Road. So
you're having a BART station too, aren't you?
there is consideration, there's no money, but there's consideration to study an extension of E-BART past Hillcrest and the location has been selected. It's where the McCullough Trail crosses State Highway 4. And if there ever is an expansion of EBART toward Brentwood, that's where the station will go. So if someone wants to send us money, we'll build it.
Because
I'll name it after you.
the community college is developing more of a campus down there too.
Community College is actually being constructed, or will start construction soon, in the same subdivision I spoke of earlier, the Trilogy subdivision. With the passing of the bond recently by the Community College District, they are going to build basically another Los Medanos College, which can house up to, I believe, 5,000 students up in that subdivision. And that's at the corner of Marsh Creek Road and Vineyards Parkway. So that is coming. They are, I believe, already own the land, and they have started building the infrastructure for it. And given the passage of that bond, the Community College District intends to start construction.
Well, it looks great.
I have a question.
Okay.
I have a question.
Was there no other questions?
I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You are talking about restaurants and shops. What about manufacturing?
There's some manufacturing going on. They've, and I don't recall the exact businesses, but there were 2 or 3 major manufacturing type businesses that have come to Brentwood. Like I said, I don't recall the names, but we have an economic development department which is staffed by 3 people whose sole job is to try and get those type of businesses, along with commercial and retail, to come to Brentwood. Like I said, I think the Highway 4 improvements and the interchange improvements help us, because it gets the people who are shopping. The streets of Brentwood has done very, very well. So all of those are coming. I just don't have the exact numbers. Yeah, you're talking to the traffic engineer. I'm the dumbest guy there.
As I do remember, the Brentwood Boulevard specific plan toward the northern end has several areas set aside for light industrial also.
Quick comment, if I may. Steve, I just want to commend you and the city of Brentwood for the job you're doing, because obviously you've really put some thought into carefully planned, managed, and controlled development, and looking at the ability to add in that type of housing that, in Orinda, for example, the housing element is like fighting words for so many many members of our community. So it's great to see that a community that has the opportunity to grow, do so carefully, logically, and really providing housing opportunities for a broad swath of the population. I just want to say, great job.
No further questions?
If I may, because depending on what one's prejudices are, one of the first things you look at when you get this packet is the RA10A, and the fact that Brentwood has done as well as it has relieves some of the depression otherwise, I feel looking at some of the other ones. Again, the kudos that Brentwood has gotten.
Thanks. I gotta come see you guys more often. I usually get beat up.
If there's nothing else, I'm going to go ahead and move that we recommend approval of the City of Brentwood's calendar years 2012 and 2013 Growth Management Program Compliance Checklist.
I'll give you a second on that.
Second by Larry. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Thank you. Martin's requested that we flip the next 2 items and discuss first the future role of the CAC GMP subcommittee. So with the consent of the committee, we'll go ahead and move on to 2.4 and come back to 2.3.
Mr. Chairman, Martin Engelman, Deputy Executive Director for Planning at the Contra Costa Transportation Authority. Good evening, everyone. And Dave Current knows more about this than I do, but you've had a subcommittee on growth management for some time, I think decades, in fact. And traditionally, or historically, when we got a growth management checklist, it would be forwarded to the subcommittee, and the subcommittee would delve down into it and come up with questions regarding the jurisdiction's compliance, forward those questions to me, and I would in turn forward them to the local jurisdictions. Local jurisdictions would then come to this meeting prepared to respond to those questions. And I guess over the past year or so, the activity of the subcommittee has been declining somewhat. And also, I think the checklists are becoming more routine, especially for this current reporting period. There's no major leap or thrust that the jurisdictions have to take or accomplish to be in compliance with the growth management program. They are, they've all pretty much adopted their urban limit line and adopted their Measure J growth management element, and we no longer have standards for local streets, and we no longer have performance measures for fire, police, water, and parks, and sanitary and flood. So, so at this point, I guess it's a question before the CAC, whether or not they want to disband the CAC GMP subcommittee, or maybe just have it more of an ad hoc committee that looks at checklists where there's a specific issue, where there's a specific compliance issue. And if that were the case, the checklist would go directly to you through your packets, and the subcommittee would not convene to look them over. Alternatively, we could continue to forward the checklist as early as possible to the subcommittees and the subcommittee and see if they're interested in convening or individually making comments. We've had some success with that, where the individuals on the subcommittee write their own comments, and we forward those to the jurisdiction, and then you can ask those questions on the night of the meeting, and that's kind of what happened tonight. So that's the question before you, I believe. David, chime in if you think.
Yes. If we transport ourselves back 17 years ago when the CAC was first formed, the internet was not very prominent. That we got these checklists, and we had a subcommittee who would convene at the authority's library, where we would have access to all of the general plan documentations, transportation plan, everything that had to do with every jurisdiction. And as you saw with the Brentwood GMC today, there was a tremendous reliance on saying, well, here's the, here's the site for the housing element. Here's the site for every city has got everything on the web, to where there's really not a need to convene at the authorities' offices to review the documents. And another issue 17 years ago is that the jurisdictions were not that excited at providing affordable housing or complying with other aspects of the growth management checklist. And as Martin has sort of alluded to, we've pretty much got every jurisdiction doing what they have to do, where there haven't really been any big issues. I mean, when we first formed a subcommittee, we would actually go to those jurisdictions that were not complying and talk directly to the planning people, just trying to convince them that we were serious, and they would sit down there and really explain to us what they're doing and all that kind of stuff. And we even at some times would actually talk to some housing advocates to see if they could help us put some pressure on some of these communities, and we've kind of whipped them into shape, So in that in mind, I kind of think that we need to get into the 21st century, that every one of us here has a responsibility and the capability of actually reviewing all of the documents. And what I would suggest, Diane and Martin, is that right now you send when we get a new checklist in, you send attachments to the growth management checklist. It's not that big of a deal to send it to all of the members on the CAC so that you can review these documents. I found it quite interesting today to go into the websites and check out what Concord and especially Brentwood were doing. If you're at all familiar with general plan documentations, and it makes very interesting reading to go through and see exactly what every city's doing. And I think that it should be the responsibility of every member. Now, the only downside of not having the subcommittee, and I'm not sure if these are major, is that one, because of the Brown Act, the subcommittee was able to do and talk about things that the whole CIC cannot do. And I think there was some benefit to that, to where that we would have 4 or 5 people on the subcommittee where we could actually send emails back and forth without any fear of violating the Brown Act. And the other thing, too, is that if we all send our questions to Martin, I was kind of the filter for the questions that actually made it to him, so that they would try to have the most pertinency to it. So, but overall, I think that the subcommittee is no longer necessary unless there's some great swell of wanting to keep it.
Well, I've certainly noticed that the two tonight have been very straightforward and pretty perfunctory, and I've also noticed that the packets are a lot thinner than they used to be because much of it is reference to websites. The only thing I would think might be helpful is if committee members had a bit more time. So maybe if key things were sent by email to the committee, maybe once a jurisdiction is determined to be on the agenda, just an email with the key website addresses for us to follow. And that way, we can still stay with the publication schedule of the actual hard copies, but give people a little more warning, a little more time to look.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I could make a suggestion. One thing we could look into would be when a checklist arrives, once it's gone through preliminary review by staff here, we post it on the CCTA website. It is a public document.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just email the CAC to say, if you want to look at the City of Wise checklist, click here. You click there, the checklist comes up. And so those who are interested could do that, and those who aren't could wait till the meeting time. And then the information would show up in your packet. There would have to be some kind of a protocol for comments. Some of you may know, we don't comment directly to the jurisdictions. You comment through authority staff. And actually, since Dave Current is our growth management mentor, I would prefer that you comment through him and that he forwards the comments to me, as long as he's in town, and then I can forward them to the jurisdiction before this meeting. But that's one way to take advantage of new technology. I mean, I don't think it's efficient for 20 people to open a checklist and read it cover to cover. That's why we have the subcommittee, to give the whole CAC the confidence that somebody's looking at this stuff. But we could, that's just an option that came to mind right now. On the spot idea.
The only issue with that is the Brown Act. That if I were to act as a conduit for the questions, if more than a majority actually contacted me, that would be a violation. Although I'm not exactly sure what the ramifications, if any, what that would be. But that's the only thing that comes to mind.
Actually, we're not a determinative body, so
Well, we still have to take the AB 1, 2, 3, 4 ethics classes. I think we still are under some obligation with the Brown Act. But, the thing about the Brown Act is that the penalty is really that any decisions that were made by the rendering body could be challenged. But since we, as you we're starting to point out, since we don't really have any power per se, it's almost a moot point. But that's the only thing that I come up with. And the other thing, too, is that by having the subcommittee, there were some people that felt obligated to actually read the stuff, whereas if we have 20 people, it's so easy to sit back around the pool, and not just wait to Wednesday to come,
Well, I think the posting on the website with a email with a pointer and including the email with any comments, direct them first to Dave, and let Dave continue to be the clearinghouse for comments to staff. I think that would strike me as workable. Sally?
Comment? I found using websites a little disconcerting because very often they just put everything in it. I mean, starting with the city council minutes and then on down. And if you're looking for something specific, even the number of pages they say, that you use this from one page to 600 or something. It's in there somewhere, but it isn't going to be continuously paged. The numbering of the pages aren't consistent. So you finally spend a lot of time getting down to what you wanted. I was looking for the urban limit line information. And in Brentwood, they put that in the congestion management plan, or whatever that last thing is. And then if you wanted to see where the urban limit line is, it's the very last thing at the very end of that website. And it's beautiful. It's all colors and everything. And the urban limit line was supposed to be a purple line, and I envisioned it be kind of more or less circular around the town. I couldn't find it. I just couldn't find the urban limit line on that map. There were so many different colors and nothing continuously. Anyway, I would guess that if the jurisdictions like to use that method of conveying their information, that they edit it a little bit, use a little idea of what is it we really want. Of course, I think maybe the planning committee or some of the later groups who do look at this, they want maybe everything. But, it just was difficult for me to find exactly where the housing element was. I finally got it.
What we're talking about, though, is the checklist itself, which would be fairly specific and would be on the authority's website, would have a direct link to get to it, rather than going in cold into a full city website, which can contain a lot of information.
A couple comments, Sally. A lot of those times the documents on the city websites are set for printed. And when you bring them up on the web, all the pagination is screwed up because it's set to a page size. And then depending on how they've structured that document, lots of luck in finding it. Okay? So a lot of cases, the cities need to be able to look and say, oh, this has got to be structured for reading on a 21-inch monitor, and uses that as a standard base versus, okay, somebody's going to look at a tablet with a 10-inch monitor, and they're going to have a little bit more difficulty, but it's still a lot simpler than trying to read something that's written for a printed document and all the various paginations that screw it up. Run into that lots of times. So that's where a lot of that difficulty comes in at. The second question, Martin, would it be possible to set up a sort of a common email address for if anybody wanted to submit a question, they could send it to the common email address, lets everybody in the CAC know, and if they want to read it, they can read it, and then Dave could take and summarize any emails that are posted to that, so that all the CAC then has access to this common email address for comments on the checklists. And it's still, Dave would then still be performing the summary function up to the to your group.
I think our website has the capability of accepting new email addresses. We have a public email, we have an info email, we have a CTP email. I think we can do that.
And then the question is, what's anybody's reaction to that? Versus always just sending it off to Dave, and Dave's the only one that sees the emails because nobody else does.
Martin, do you feel you have enough direction to head off with this?
Well, I think I need some clarification. Are you comfortable then with having the whole group look at it and not have an assigned 4 people who are responsible? Or do you want to continue with, say, you 4 or 5 people look at the thing, but we do it through the web, and the rest can look as well, but you've still designated, 3 or 4 or 5 people to do the heavy lifting, because otherwise it does become, everybody thinks everybody else is doing it, or it's just it's the Dave Current Review Committee, and he doesn't have any help. So, that's the only question. Do you want to continue to designate a few people who have an interest in this, because everybody's interested in different things, or do you want to just say the whole committee? It's a committee of the whole, basically.
I think the answer to that is yes. And I'm not being facetious when I say that. I think that it would be beneficial because we're just talking about an email. We're not talking about actually mailing anything out to everybody. But I think it's better to have the whole committee members get all of the checklists as soon as possible, because it can be daunting to try to get this on Saturday and try to prepare for a Wednesday meeting, especially when you got other things going on. The other side of the coin, too, is that I do fear as you pointed out, that if 20 people are responsible for reviewing the checklist, it ends up nobody does it. So I think there would be good to have 4 or 5 people who are kind of designated as the checklist checkers that can actually converse with each other. But it has to be motivated. I mean, one of the issues I had with the subcommittee is that I felt that I was doing it all alone. That I would get some comments from Sally, but the other members always seem to have something else going on. So I think that the key here is to get people who are motivated to actually go and review the documents.
I welcome having the whole committee as a whole work on it.
All right, then. And I'll get back to you on the email address.
All right, thank you. Okay, proceeding back to 2.3, the draft final feasibility of Contra Costa County Ferry Service 2015 to 2024.
Good evening. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and CAC members. My name is Peter Engel. I'm the program manager here at CCTA. I think the reason Martin wanted to switch the items is he wanted to save the best for last, so we'll try and get through this. With a little history here, the authority has never, while we obviously promote public transportation, we haven't been involved in ferry service other than interest in West County in the development of Measure J to have some funding go towards ferry service in West County in Richmond and Hercules. And the subregion in West County actually prioritize that and have money through Measure J go towards funding capital and or operating ferry service in one or both of those communities. About 18 months ago, there was some articles in the paper about communication issues between some other cities that are interested in ferry service and WETA, which is the Water Emergency Transportation Authority, and they're the agency that provides ferry service from Vallejo and Alameda and Bay Harbor and Oakland into San Francisco, and now their newest route is into South San Francisco. And so CCTA stepped in and said, well, we don't want a lot of bad press out there, and let's see if we can get everybody on the same page and talking about this. So we formed a working group that was made up of the 4 cities that are proposed to have, at some point, ferry service in Contra Costa County, and that is Richmond, Hercules, Martinez, and Antioch. And with those 4 cities, we also had staff from the RTPCs, Regional Transportation Planning Committees, that were the 3 RTPCs that have those cities within their jurisdiction. So that's WICTAC, TransPac, and TransPlan in East County. We also had representative from the county, and we had somebody from Senator DeSaulnay's office who was also kind of brought into this and wanted to see something resolved. So the working group met, and the working group also included WETA staff. So the working group met, and it was determined that, there's a lot of information out there regarding potential ridership, potential costs, and everybody's kind of reading off a different playbook. And that's where this
Would you explain who EPS is?
EPS. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll get to that in just a second. The working group decided, what we need is we all need to be reading off the same page here. So EPS is Economic Land Use, Economic and Planning Systems, Inc. It's an economic and land use consulting firm. And actually Martin had them under contract working on some other planning activities going on throughout the county. And so we were able to expand their scope and have them work with us to put together this feasibility study, which I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight for you. And their main goal was to just pull all this information together so that everybody had it in one place. What they found was there were some gaps in the information, so it got a little bit. It started out as what was being termed as white paper, and it's now a 108 or something page report that was produced because of the additional information and quite a bit of modeling work that had to be done where they had to try and determine what the potential ridership was from these communities based on growth over a 10-year planning period and alternative transportation modes within those communities and things like that. So I think what I'll do is just, do I push this button here? Which button do I push? The green one? All right. I haven't done this before, so obviously it's not working. Yeah. Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you.
She has the magic touch.
The study objectives were to, like I said, start a collaborative effort between the entities that were involved, the 4 cities and other interested groups and WETA, and to really take a look at the feasibility from a financial perspective of ferry service expansion into Contra Costa County, and then look at policy considerations that would also probably have to be made at some point in the future, and other investment priorities and studies that could potentially follow on depending on what we found in this report. So I already mentioned there was a study that was produced, I believe, in 2003, and it was at that time it was just WTA, the Water Transportation Authority. The legislature hadn't added the emergency word in there yet. They produced a report, the IOP, Implementation and Operations Plan for ferry service on San Francisco Bay. And that IOP identified the 4 cities in Contra Costa that could potentially have ferry service, and that was Richmond, Hercules, Martinez, and Antioch. So we looked at those 4 cities with direct routes to San Francisco. And then we also looked at some interline routes. So interline routes would be the vessel leaves Antioch and stops at Martinez and lets passengers off and on, and then travels to San Francisco. And we looked at Martinez to Hercules, and we looked at Antioch, Martinez, and Hercules, all of those routes. We didn't look at any interlining routes with Richmond, and the reason for that is Richmond's kind of this perfect storm where they only need to use one crew. It's like a 30-minute, it's like an hour round trip from Richmond to San Francisco and back to Richmond, and they're able to do commute trips in the morning and afternoon just using one vessel and one crew, whereas the rest of the cities are so long, it takes additional crews, which of course is more expensive, to be able to manage getting enough trips in during the peak hour service. So if we would have looked at interlining any trips with Richmond, it would have messed up Richmond's kind of perfect storm. So Richmond wasn't interested in doing that because it would have cost them more. Again, we convened the working group. One of the things in the study is looked at WIDA service, ferry service funding sources, the sources they use, and built this 10-year operational model to try and determine feasibility, and that looked at estimating ridership, evaluating the operating costs, and estimating the fare box revenues so we'd know what the subsidy requirements would be for each of those services. One of EPS's main things wasn't just to gather information, but they're also experts at looking at these things. So one of their jobs was to validate the model itself and the documentation that was being provided by WIDA, and validate that to make a determination of, yes, those are reasonable numbers, those are fairly accurate numbers. Models are never going to be 100% accurate, but they were able to validate that they made sense in how they were put together. Some key assumptions that had to be made were ridership projections through the planning period 2015 to 2035. Fares, there was fares that were established in 2009, so those fares were used with multipliers over the 10-year period. Routes and level of service. What they tried to do was find that sweet spot that would be the most cost-effective for each of those service areas. So in other words, what you try and do is you try and find three departures from each city that fit into the peak hour. You want one kind of that's early in the peak period, one that's right in that, get them to San Francisco at 7:45 for their 8 o'clock start job, and one that's a little later in the peak period. So that's what drove the levels of service and the requirement, looking at how many vessels and how many crews they would need. And then operating costs were provided by WIDA based on experience they have and the cost that they have basically operating their service. Now, WIDA actually contracts their service out. They don't operate it themselves, and they have a 10-year agreement with the current operator. Basically, it's 5 years with an option for 5 additional years, so they're very confident on their costs. They know what their costs are going to be over the next 10 years, and that's why we use that 10-year planning window. Some policy considerations that came out of the study, how funding sources are going to be allocated in the future, prioritizing the expansion of services, who's going to come first, which of these cities is going to come first, local economic impacts. We didn't study. A lot of cities are looking for a ferry service. A ferry terminal will provide economic opportunities within their downtown communities. That's a study all its own. We didn't have the budget to jump into that heavy of a scope, but we do recognize that that is something that still needs to be looked at. The provision of emergency services, again, the budget wasn't big enough to look at that. That's something that still needs to be looked at, and it needs to be looked at along with county emergency operations folks. They're the ones that know the most about how what's needed in the event of an emergency and could best determine how ferry service can help with that. Alternative technologies, there's currently WIDA operates the catamaran type vessel. There's some discussion of the possibility of maybe a hovercraft being more effective in areas where dredging would have to occur, like Hercules. That's not a preferred vessel technology for WIDA, but again, it's something that could be studied more. Whether or not to use direct route services to San Francisco or use these interline services, and also the role that CCTA might play in both planning and funding for ferry service. These are all things that still need to be looked at and talked about more. So ferry service operating funding, obviously Farebox, the fares they receive from folks. What the study looks at from a feasibility perspective, the metric is called Farebox recovery ratio. It's very commonly used in public transportation from bus, trains, and ferries. Basically, it's the percent of money you receive in fares as a ratio to the total cost of operating the service. WIDA's primary operating funding source is Regional Measure 1 and Regional Measure 2. Those are the bridge tolls. The additional funds, last two increases of dollar in bridge toll funds have gone to fund both those RM1 and RM2. That funding is flat. In other words, WIDA just receives a flat amount every year. They don't receive an inflationary amount. So obviously their operating costs are going up every year between paying crews more every year and fuel especially. Matter of fact, fuel is the highest cost driver in operating the vessels. And they do receive a small amount in Alameda on the Bay Farm Island subdivision, some local tax measure assessments on property taxes there. So those are really the three only funding sources that WIDA uses for operating costs. This slide gives you an idea of the 2015 ridership projections that we got out of the model. You can see on the far left, the red bar is Richmond, a significantly higher projected ridership than the other three terminal sites. The three bars, multicolored bars on the right, are the interline services. So each of those colors represents ridership at each of the different terminals, and it gets a little complicated. You can see ridership drops potentially from some because the trip's going to be longer, so people will choose to take an alternative mode because the additional trip time. In some cases, there's people that are going from Antioch to Martinez, for instance, and that's their trip. They're not continuing on to San Francisco. So there's some interesting things there that are occurring. This slide shows you basically the cost of each of those services over the 10-year operating window that we looked at. The red bar is the subsidy that would be required for that service, and the blue bar is the Farebox recovery. So, for instance, in Richmond, the far left, 44% of the cost of so it will cost $35.6 million to operate the service over the 10-year period. 44% of that would be paid for by fares, and 56% would be subsidized. On the far right, the Antioch Martinez Hercules interline service, $119.2 million to operate over the 10 years. 75% of that would have to be subsidized, only a 25% fare box recovery. WEDA's current metric that they use, it's a target actually, is 40%. They want to run 40% during peak hour service system-wide. So that's the number we use to make a determination on what was feasible and what wasn't feasible as far as operating the service. You can see system-wide right now they're at 46%, Vallejo's at 62%, Alameda, Oakland 60%, and then the bars on the right are the proposed expansion services. Right now, Richmond's the only service that would meet that at 44% fare box recovery. This is just a quick look at the capital costs. I'll tell you that these numbers are not necessarily old. They were done in the last few years. They're certainly not, numbers that were done last month or 6 months ago. They are not inflated, so they are from the time they were done, and they were done based on conceptual plans, engineers' estimates off of conceptual plans. So their accuracy, they are what we have right now to work on, but clearly those numbers will escalate over years, and some of these services are proposed not to go into service for, several, if not many years, so those numbers would escalate significantly. One thing I did want to point out that what you do see in savings from a capital perspective is in the interline services, the terminals are still, the terminal costs aren't going to change, but the cost of the vessels will change because you're able to eliminate spares when you have these interline services. If you have direct services, each route needs 2 vessels, a regular service vessel and a spare. So when you start interlining the services, you're able to combine some of those vessels, so you can eliminate the need for some vessels. We made the recommendation to the authority, this is in June, to release the study for the public to review it, and they did recommend doing that. So the study is available on our website if you want to take a look at it. There was no decisions made about, our supporting of any of the services or making a recommendation to fund one over the other. It's basically releasing this report so the cities can look at the operating costs and make determinations on this, how they want to move forward, if they want to do further studies, if they just want to move away from ferry service for now and wait, a few years till new projections come out, and then bring this back. So, just as an update with regard to West County, Richmond is really moving forward with this. They're in talks and with WEDA right now to try and put together a service provision agreement. There needs to be a determination regarding the Measure J funds that are going to West County and how those funds will be split between Richmond and Hercules. That is something that is supposed to be recommended. That split is supposed to be decided by WEDA staff and WICTAC, the RTPC in West County, and then they will make a recommendation to the authority board as to how they want those funds to be split. So they're negotiating that right now, and hopefully by September, October, there will be some decisions made, and there will be a services agreement put in place between WEDA and Richmond. WEDA wants that services agreement in place before they spend $34 million to build 2 vessels for Richmond. And WEDA is providing all the capital costs for these services, so they'll be paying for the vessels and the terminal site in Richmond for that. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
I'd like to ask about the emergency alternative. I mean, there's something you haven't discussed yet, is in case of a bridge outage or earthquake or, heaven forbid, something foreign coming in.
Right. So I mentioned a little bit that we think that's a necessary thing that needs to be studied further, but it needs to involve the county emergency services division and potentially state emergency services. I can't remember exactly what the department name is, but they need to come in and look at, because they are also aware of other potential transportation issues that could occur in the event of an earthquake or large fire or something. So they would definitely need to have input on something like that as the most appropriate place for potential ferry service. One of the concerns is the cost of building the terminal and then not having service to the terminal, having it just sit there in case there's an emergency. Somebody has to maintain that. You know, it's in a very harsh environment, being on the water, and it would take a lot of maintenance. So there's costs associated with that, and somebody has to, you know, be willing to pay for that, and that
I would
hasn't
think
been
there,
determined yet.
first of all, it would have to have passenger service.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's what WIDA's perspective is you know, you have to have a viable passenger service to make it cost effective to put in the terminal. And I'll tell you, one of the things they're doing is WIDA's looking at designing some floating temporary docks that they can keep stored around the Bay Area, around certain parts of the Bay. And in the event of an emergency, they can bring those out by barge and take them to a specific location. So it would be like a temporary gangway that could be used for a short period of time in the event of emergency.
And the vessels would be something you've already started using.
That's right. That's right. So vessels at that point would have to be, you know, there would have to be I suppose they could take spare vessels and put them into service on a short-term basis to provide emergency response type services.
My question is, and I understand this is a very limited study, but was it ever talked about going from like Hercules or Martinez to Oakland instead of to San Francisco? Or, you know, in addition to, I guess? Or is that?
No, it wasn't. And I think, you know, WIDA's always had in their short period of time, it's always been everybody trying to get into the city for you know, across the bay, so into San Francisco or South San Francisco. South San Francisco from Alameda just started last year, 18 months ago now, and it's been a very slow growth, I think slower than they anticipated. So to answer your question, I think when we ran the model for service from Antioch to Martinez, WIDA staff was surprised how many people were just making that trip and not continuing. So I think it kind of opened their eyes a little bit as to other potential services in the Bay Area. I think there's some concern because so many of these don't show feasibility going into San Francisco, which is still the largest corridor. But I think, you know, one of the things that we didn't look at that I think WIDA wants to now look at is an interline service from Vallejo to Hercules to San Francisco, because you can see on the map there, it seems to make a little bit more sense. Vallejo is experiencing too much ridership at certain peak hour times. So if we could add a trip, you know, they're not going to want to have their direct trips lengthened by stopping at Hercules, but if we could add service that started in Vallejo and then went to Hercules, you know, that might be something that would work. I say WIDA. So there's lots of ideas that we're trying to plant in their head to take a look at some of these other potential service areas.
You know, sort of a same continuation, same questions. What about the South Bay? Down the Redwood Shores, or if there was a spot down to, you know, getting to Mountain View and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Because the growth down there.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. It's a 2-hour trip from Antioch to San Francisco, so it's, you know, you're talking 4 hours or longer to go from Antioch to San Jose, and at that point it's easier just to drive, I think, even with traffic. But
some days it's not.
Yeah, you know, Redwood City is on WIDA's short list for expansion. After Richmond and potentially Berkeley, Richmond, Redwood City, and Treasure Island are the 4 kind of near-term expansions they're looking at. I think after their experience with South San Francisco, they're really leery about Redwood City. I think they're excited about Richmond, that there's a lot of potential there. And Berkeley has had some issues with dredging, and I think they're kind of backing out of, so more efforts even being put into Richmond at this point because there's no dredging issues, and it's a short crossing. So,
Peter, could you refresh my memory on the previous ferry service to Richmond or from Richmond?
yeah, we were just talking about that a few weeks ago. I guess it started after the Loma Prieta earthquake when the bridge was being repaired, and it was. I think the problem, WIDA believes the problem why it wasn't successful once the bridge, why it didn't retain its ridership, is it was real slow. It was a traditional hulled vessel, and I think it took close to an hour to cross, whereas the catamarans can do it in 25 minutes. So I think that ran until 2000. Somebody said 2002 or maybe it was 1998, something like that, is when it went out of service. So
Thank you.
it was not too long ago. There's some experience there, and we've actually received lots of comments from people in Richmond who are really excited about the possibility of the service coming back.
Isn't one of the reasons for all of this is that nobody really wants to build another bridge across the bay?
Yeah, nobody wants to build another bridge, and obviously the bridges are at or near capacity. BART's at or near capacity. The Transbay buses that are running are at or near capacity. There's a need for additional capacity.
So when you figure the costs of the ferry service, you got to think of what would the cost be for building a bridge.
Well, that's yeah.
Out of curiosity, you said, an hour for a hulled boat and 25 minutes for a catamaran. What's the travel time for a hovercraft?
We don't know.
Would it be faster than a catamaran?
Well, they suggest that hovercraft can operate about 30% faster.
Okay.
But, I would suspect they would be more susceptible to choppy seas than a catamaran would be. The other issue with hovercraft is they have to use a platform for landing. They don't float. So the whole infrastructure at the San Francisco, or there would need to be infrastructure built on the San Francisco side to accommodate that type of landing. They're smaller, so they can't carry as many passengers. So the fare revenue wouldn't be as great from that. And we haven't studied the environmental impacts regarding noise and stuff like that a hovercraft would have over the catamaran service.
You remember the SFO helicopter hovercraft that used to run between Oakland Airport and SFO? Fascinating, but incredibly noisy.
Yeah, very noisy.
In terms of the terminals that are going to be built, I'm curious how much of Measure J funds would go into that compared to the cities paying for it. For example, like in the city of Hercules, I saw in our 2013 annual report that they're building a new intermodal transit hub up there, which might include the terminal. I'm kind of curious how much Measure J would go in there versus the city, and same thing with Richmond as well.
Right now, there's not proposed to be any Measure J money going into the capital part of the service.
Okay, good.
WIDA gets a separate RM2 pot of money for capital projects, and they also get some Prop 1B money for capital projects. So their capital plan is, depending on the cost. Now, as these costs escalate, it might change. But right now, they're able to provide those capital costs with their existing RM2 and Prop 1B funding. So right now, the Measure J funds that are in West County are strictly proposed to be used for operating. Hercules might use some for some planning. They recently, the city of Hercules recently acquired the point that's right south of where the proposed intermodal transit center is. That's going to be the rail station. Okay. And they want to look at what it would cost. They want to do a similar conceptual estimate of turning that into the ferry terminal The advantage to that is it's farther. People could walk farther out, so there wouldn't be as much dredging that would have to occur. The downside of it is, of course, people would have to walk a lot farther out. So.
So then the WIDA would be paying for then the boats, the cities and WIDA would be paying for the terminals, and then Measure J and the CCTA would be paying for operating costs.
No, CCTA isn't proposing at this point to be paying for any of this service.
Anything at all?
The service would have to be paid for by the cities or some other funding source. Maybe they could do a tax assessment or something. There's been talk of a regional Measure 3 that could provide funding for operating these services. But at this point, there's no funding proposed, and that's one of the problems, is there's no funding proposed other than the fares to help subsidize these other services. Now, Richmond, they have that money under Measure J, and that will cover the subsidy portion of the service. So from their perspective, their service is fully funded. WIDA will cover the capital costs, the vessels in the terminal, and fares, and Measure J in Richmond's case, and potentially Hercules' case. There's not enough in the Measure J to pay for both. West County needs to figure out, who's going to get it and how they're going to split it. So that's where they're at right now, is trying to make that determination.
Doesn't the Golden Gate Bridge District have control of the Vallejo, the one from Marin County?
Yes, they do.
Yes.
So, yeah,
and then who pays for the one in Vallejo?
Vallejo was brought under WIDA. So the city of Vallejo used to run that service, and Alameda, Oakland used to be run by Alameda. And when WIDA was formed under state legislation, they were required to bring Vallejo and Alameda under their agency. So now Vallejo and the rest of the services from the East Bay are all under WIDA, but Golden Gate Bridge and Transit District still runs the Golden Gate Ferry from Larkspur.
Mm-hmm.
Any further questions? Well, thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure, we'll keep you informed at future meetings if things change or if anything exciting happens.
Okay. I've had a couple of additional things in my life that really soaked up additional blocks of time, so I didn't get this report prepared in time to ship it over to Diane to print. So I would just briefly discuss the last week's meeting of the Authority Board. Prior to the beginning of the regular Authority Board was the initial meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee on Authority Salaries and Benefits. I did not attend, but according to the agenda, they just had the selection of chair and vice chair and an overall policy review relating to the current authority salaries and benefits, and the rest of the meeting was going to be in closed session.
Did we get a raise?
What?
Did we get a raise?
Oh, yeah. Only if the IRS increases the mileage figure. Among the other items on the consent calendar was a placeholder on having CC take over project management for the Hercules Rail Station project. The legislative update, which is kind of early days yet, update on the status of the 2014 Countywide Transportation Plan and the Public Education and Outreach Plan. The approvals were also granted for funding various programs for fiscal year 2014-15. A verbal update was made on the City of Hercules project and accepted. As you may remember, the City of Hercules has really struggled to recover from a real problem with corruption. And they've done a fairly good job, in my estimation. But one of the things we're doing is CCTA is taking over the management of that project to help. They're still pretty well a skeleton staff in the city government as they continue their fiscal recovery. First major item was a presentation on the MDC freight movement study and the county's northern waterfront revitalization plan. The freight study is mainly an Alameda County thing, except that we have important movement corridors come through Contra Costa County, namely the rail lines and Interstate 80 for trucking. Both of these studies are in fairly early stages. Second major item was to approve the proposed budget for the authority for fiscal year 2014-15. The overall budget totals about $278.9 million. And the final regular agenda item was approval to release the draft final financial feasibility of Contra Costa County Ferry Service. And of course, you've just gotten essentially the presentation that the authority board got, except that they did approve the release of the study. 3 of our 4 regional transportation planning committees and 4 cities will be involved in the review since they will be directly affected. And there were no major highlights in the executive director's comments. So I will tack on next month's meeting and get them both printed out together for you. So do we have any other member comments? Anything on future agenda items?
I do. I know we've been talking a lot about the affordable housing thing and what's going on, and I don't know if you guys would want me to try and find some presenters. I don't know if that's how it works. But I know there's a lot of affordable housing groups, nonprofits that build this stuff, and maybe it'd be good to get a couple of them to come in and tell us what they're facing in our communities. I don't know if that's how it works, but I'm willing to try and help find us presenters if the group would like me to do that.
Well, certainly if you come up with candidates, get in touch with Martin and Diane about the possibility, okay?
I think that is a very worthy topic because as we see with all of these checklists coming in, when redevelopment agencies existed, jurisdictions could actually construct or finance the construction of affordable housing, but since redevelopment agencies have been eliminated, jurisdictions are kind of dependent on developers to come in, and it's going to be a real problem. It's like when I was reading all of these, like looking at Concord's charts. I mean, they just had all this above moderate housing, and we're, housing, like my niece just bought $1 million house in San Jose, which would probably fit in this room, I'm not exaggerating too much on that one. You got to ask the question, where is the affordable housing going to be? And I think that's a very worthy topic. I don't think it's just a matter of like talking to Bridge or Eads or anything like that. I think it's going to have to come from the state level. So I think it would be really great to find out what the collective thinking is on a state level as far as providing affordable housing goes.
Any other comments?
Yeah, just tagging on what Dave said there, that affordable housing struggle would have to be preceded by a struggle to make politicians affordable.
can't have our politicians costing too much. Although, as it used to be said, or at least in the old days when you bought them, they stayed bought.
Yeah, now you need billionaires to invest in congressmen. You know, there's the bumper sticker used to be, save America, invest in a congressman or something.
All right, well, if there's no other business, I will declare us adjourned. Thank you all. See you next month.